The morning sun rose over Refuge Station like any other morning on the remote mining planet of Kepler 442. Commander, Lisa Bennett stood in the control room and watched her security team run through another drill. The miners complained as usual about the interruption to their work schedules. Pete Dawson, the head of mining operations, shook his head and muttered something about wasted time and lost productivity. Lisa ignored him because she had heard it all before during the 3 years she had commanded this outpost. Greg Sullivan, the chief engineer, walked into the control room with a cup of coffee in his hand and a tired smile on his face. He was a man in his early 40s with graying hair and hands that were always stained with grease from keeping the aging equipment running. He looked at the security drill happening outside and chuckled softly, before he spoke to Lisa about how her healthy pessimism was keeping everyone on their toes. Lisa smiled back at him but said nothing because she knew that preparation was the only thing that kept people alive on the frontier. The outpost housed exactly 200 people who worked in various capacities to extract rare minerals from the planet's crust. Most of them were miners and engineers, but there was also a small medical staff led by Dr. Helen Carter and a security detail of about 40 personnel under Lisa's command. The base itself consisted of several connected habitat modules, a large mining operation with dozens of shafts going deep underground, and a small landing pad for supply ships that came once every 3 months. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was running the drill outside with his usual enthusiasm. He was 28 years old and eager to prove himself worthy of his position as second in command of security. He had trained extensively at the military academy, but had never seen real combat, which made him study Lisa's methods with intense focus. She had served in 3 border conflicts and earned a reputation for thinking outside the box when it came to tactics and strategy. Jake admired her greatly and wanted to learn everything he could from her experience. Amy Chen sat at the communications console and monitored the various sensor arrays that surrounded the outpost. She was 25 years old with quick reflexes and an even quicker mind when it came to technology and electronic systems. Her job was to maintain contact with Earth and monitor space traffic in the system, though there was rarely anything to report since Kepler 442 was far from major shipping lanes. She was halfway through her daily system check when something unusual appeared on her screen. The sensors had picked up strange readings at the edge of the star system. Amy frowned and ran a diagnostic to make sure the equipment was functioning properly. The readings showed multiple objects entering the system at speeds that suggested faster than light travel. She called out to Lisa and pointed at the screen. Lisa walked over quickly and studied the data with growing concern. Before either of them could say anything more, the readings vanished completely as if they had never been there at all. Greg suggested it was probably just sensor ghosts or debris from an old asteroid collision. Amy agreed reluctantly because there was no other explanation that made sense. Lisa stared at the empty screen for a long moment before she nodded and told everyone to get back to work. Something about those readings bothered her, but she could not explain why she felt uneasy. She decided to mention it in her next report to Earth, though the message would take weeks to arrive and weeks more to get a response. The drill ended and the miners returned to their work in the tunnels below the surface. Pete Dawson led his crews back underground with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent his entire adult life in mining operations. He knew every tunnel and shaft in the network and treated his workers like family. He was protective of them and skeptical of military protocols that he saw as unnecessary interference with real work. Lisa understood his perspective even if she disagreed with his conclusions about the importance of security. 12 hours passed without incident. The day shift ended and the night shift began their work under artificial lights. Dr. Helen Carter finished treating a minor injury in the medical bay and updated her research notes on local microbial life that she had been studying for the past year. She was a woman of 36 with a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that helped her cope with the isolation of frontier life. She enjoyed the research work because it gave her something to focus on besides the routine medical issues that came with running a small outpost. Amy Chen was still at her console when the new readings appeared. This time they did not vanish. Her screen filled with multiple contacts appearing in orbit around the planet. She felt her heart start to race as she counted the signatures. 12 contacts became 20, then 30, then 47. They were ships, big ones, and they did not match any design in the human database. She triggered the emergency alert and called for Commander Bennett immediately. Lisa arrived within seconds and stared at the screen in disbelief. 47 unknown warships had taken up positions around the planet in what looked like a blockade formation. She grabbed the communications equipment and tried to establish contact with the unknown vessels. There was no response to her repeated hails. She tried different frequencies and languages but received only silence in return. The ships just sat there in orbit like silent predators watching their prey. Greg Sullivan arrived next, followed quickly by Lieutenant Morrison and several other senior staff members. They crowded around the console and studied the sensor data. The ships were massive, far larger than any human military vessel, and their energy signatures suggested technology that was more advanced than anything humanity currently possessed. Greg ran calculations and estimated that each ship could carry hundreds or even thousands of troops if they were troop transports. Lisa made the decision to initiate full lockdown protocols. She hit the alarm and gave orders over the intercom for all personnel to report to their emergency stations. The outpost went dark as non-essential systems shut down to reduce their electronic signature. The security teams armed themselves with every weapon available and took up defensive positions. Civilians were directed to reinforce shelters deep underground, where they would be protected from orbital bombardment. Pete Dawson and his miners emerged from the tunnels with confused expressions that quickly turned serious when they understood what was happening. Pete gathered his people and led them to the shelters while quietly organizing the miners who had military experience into auxiliary defense teams. Dr. Carter began preparing the medical bay for casualties and converted additional spaces into emergency triage areas. The transmission finally came through after 2 hours of tense waiting. The alien voice was translated by the computer into flat, emotionless English. The message was simple and terrifying. The speakers identified themselves as representatives of the Krell Dominion. They stated that humanity had built settlements on territory that belonged to them. Refuge station and all personnel were ordered to surrender immediately for processing. Refusal would result in complete annihilation. They gave Lisa 1 hour to comply. Lisa asked for more time to consider their demands, buying precious hours for her people to prepare. She knew what processing meant, because she had seen intelligence reports from other frontier worlds that had encountered hostile alien species. Processing did not mean diplomatic negotiations or peaceful relocation. It meant slavery or worse. The Krell were not interested in dialogue or compromise. They were interested in total submission. She called a meeting of all senior staff and explained the situation honestly. They discussed options for escape, but the Krell blockade made that impossible. The 3 small transport shuttles at the outpost could not possibly evacuate 200 people, and even if they could, the Krell ships would destroy them before they reached orbit. Surrender was not an option because it meant death or slavery for everyone. That left only one choice. Lisa made the announcement over the intercom to the entire outpost. She explained the situation and gave everyone a choice. They could attempt to flee in the limited transport capacity available, or they could stay and fight against impossible odds. She told them honestly that fighting probably meant dying, but at least they would die free. She put it to a vote and waited. Every single person voted to stay and fight. Not one person chose to run. Lisa felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness as she realized these people were willing to die rather than surrender. She addressed them one more time and promised she would make the Krell pay dearly for every inch of ground they took. The preparation began in earnest. Greg Sullivan gathered his engineering team and started rigging defensive systems throughout the facility. He converted mining equipment into weapons and set up improvised explosive devices in key locations. Dr. Carter stockpiled medical supplies and prepared for the wounded that would inevitably come. Pete Dawson led his miners in preparing the tunnel network as fallback positions and ambush points. Jake Morrison approached Lisa and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Could they actually win against such overwhelming force? Lisa looked at the young lieutenant and gave him an honest answer. Probably not, she said. But they could make the Krell pay such a terrible price that the aliens would regret ever coming to this planet. Jake nodded and went back to Orga. The Krell dropships landed just after dawn in coordinated positions around Refuge Station. 40 ships touched down simultaneously, and their cargo ramps dropped open to release waves of alien warriors onto the surface. The Krell were terrifying to look at, because they stood 7 feet tall with 4 arms and bodies covered in thick segmented armor that seemed to be part of their natural biology. They carried advanced energy weapons that glowed with blue light and moved in tight military formations that spoke of discipline and experience. Commander Lisa Bennett watched them through the surveillance cameras and counted approximately 2,000 troops spreading out across the landing zones. The Krell commanders clearly expected this to be a quick and easy operation because they advanced with confidence toward the outpost. Their formations were textbook perfect, and their movements showed they had done this many times before against many different species. They had no reason to believe humans would be any different from the other primitives they had conquered. Lisa let them come closer without giving any orders to fire. She had positioned her security forces in hidden locations with carefully planned fields of fire that overlapped to create maximum damage. The open ground between the landing zones and the outpost looked like easy terrain to cross, but Lisa and Greg Sullivan had spent hours turning it into a carefully prepared killing zone. The Krell did not know they were walking into a trap. The alien warriors reached the outer markers that Greg had placed weeks ago during one of his many preparations. Lisa gave the signal and Greg pressed the detonator with a grim smile on his face. The mining equipment that had been scattered across the field suddenly erupted in massive explosions. Greg had converted excavation charges into improvised directional mines that sent shrapnel and debris flying in all directions. The first wave of Krell disappeared in fire and smoke. Before the aliens could recover from the shock, Lisa ordered her forces to open fire. The security teams had positioned themselves in reinforced bunkers and behind blast shields with overlapping fields of fire. They used kinetic weapons that fired armor-piercing rounds at hypersonic speeds. The Krell armor had been designed to diffuse and absorb energy weapons, but it provided almost no protection against solid projectiles moving at such extreme velocities. The Krell warriors fell by the dozens as bullets tore through their armor and bodies. The aliens tried to return fire with their energy weapons, but they could not locate the hidden human positions quickly enough. The blue plasma bolts hit empty ground or reinforced barriers while the human gunfire continued to cut through the alien ranks with brutal efficiency. Within minutes, over 300 Krell lay dead or dying on the killing ground. The surviving aliens retreated in disorder, something their commanders had not anticipated. The Krell regrouped at their landing zones and immediately called for orbital support to destroy the human defensive positions. The warships in orbit locked onto the coordinates provided by the ground forces and prepared to launch precision strikes. The Krell expected to see the human bunkers disappear in balls of fire. Amy Chen had been monitoring the Krell communications since the landing, and she knew the orbital strike was coming. She activated the electronic warfare protocols that Greg had helped her develop over the past 12 hours. False targeting data flooded the Krell command network and caused their orbital weapons to lock onto incorrect coordinates. The strikes came down exactly as planned, but they hit empty fields several kilometers away from the actual outpost. The Krell commanders were shocked by the failed orbital bombardment, and even more shocked by the losses they had suffered in the initial assault. They gathered their officers and began analyzing what had gone wrong. The humans were not supposed to fight like this. Every other species the Krell had encountered followed predictable patterns of warfare with honor guards and ceremonial challenges and tactical doctrines that could be studied and countered. The humans showed no interest in fair combat or honorable warfare. They simply killed efficiently and without mercy. The aliens adapted quickly because they were professional soldiers despite their arrogance. They deployed heavier armor units and established proper reconnaissance to map the human defensive positions. They began probing attacks to test the defenses while their analysts studied every piece of data from the first engagement. The Krell were determined to understand their enemy before committing to another major assault. The alien commanders decided to bypass the surface defenses entirely by using the mining tunnels that their scans had revealed beneath the outpost. They selected 200 of their best warriors and sent them into the tunnel network, with orders to emerge inside the human perimeter and attack from behind. It was a sound tactical plan that should have worked against any conventional defense. Pete Dawson had spent 20 years learning every crack and crevice of the tunnel system. He knew exactly where to collapse passages, where to flood chambers with toxic mining runoff, and where to funnel attackers into prepared ambush points. He had positioned his miners at key junctions with mining lasers, explosive charges, and heavy equipment that could be used as improvised weapons. The Krell entered the tunnels expecting to find easy passage and instead walked into a nightmare. The tunnels were narrow and dark, and completely unfamiliar to the Krell warriors. Their superior numbers meant nothing in the confined spaces, where only a few could fight at once. The miners used their intimate knowledge of the network to strike from unexpected angles, and then fade away before the aliens could respond. Mining lasers cut through Krell armor at close range. Explosive charges brought down tunnel ceilings on top of advancing warriors. Heavy drilling equipment crushed aliens against the walls. Lieutenant Jake Morrison led security teams through the tunnels using maps that Pete had provided. They hit the Krell from behind and from the sides in classic guerrilla tactics. Jake had studied unconventional warfare at the academy, but this was his first real combat experience. He found that he was good at it despite his fear. He kept his teams moving and striking and fading before the aliens could coordinate a response. The battle in the tunnels lasted for 3 hours of brutal close-quarters fighting. The Krell warriors were skilled and brave, but they were fighting blind in an environment that favored the defenders completely. Pete Dawson personally killed 4 aliens with a plasma cutter before a support beam fell and trapped him briefly. 2 of his miners pulled him free and they continued fighting without pause. Of the 200 Krell who entered the tunnels, only 30 managed to escape back to the surface. The rest were buried under collapsed passages or killed in the vicious hand-to-hand fighting. The Krell commanders were enraged when they learned the extent of their losses. They had now lost over 800 warriors in less than a day against an enemy they had expected to crush within hours. The alien leadership committed more forces in frustration and anger. Additional dropships landed and brought the total Krell ground forces to over 4,000 troops. They began a systematic bombardment of the outpost's outer structures using their ship-mounted weapons. The Krell were determined to grind down the human defenders through superior firepower and overwhelming numbers. Dr. Helen Carter's medical bay filled with wounded personnel as the bombardment intensified. She worked without rest to treat burns and shrapnel wounds and broken bones. Volunteers with minimal medical training assisted her because there was too much work for one person. The casualties were mounting, but the mood remained surprisingly positive. The defenders had bloodied the Krell badly, and everyone knew they were making the aliens pay a terrible price. Lisa called her senior staff together during a brief lull in the bombardment. Greg reported that ammunition was already down to 60% of starting levels. Amy reported that she had intercepted Krell communications requesting additional specialized troops. Pete came up from the tunnels with blood on his clothes and a grim expression. Jake arrived last with a plasma burn on his shoulder that Helen had bandaged hastily. Lisa outlined a risky plan that made everyone in the room go silent. They needed intelligence on Krell capabilities and intentions. The only way to get that intelligence was to capture alien technology, specifically their communications equipment. That meant conducting a raid on one of the grounded dropships. It was dangerous and would certainly cost lives, but the information they could gain might be the difference between survival and death. Jake volunteered immediately to lead the raid. Lisa selected 30 of her best fighters to go with him. They would move at night using the terrain for cover and hit a dropship on the edge of the Krell perimeter. The goal was to seize the ship's communication systems and get out before the aliens could respond in force. Greg provided shaped charges for breaching the hull, and Amy programmed signal jammers to block Krell calls for help. Night fell, and Jake led his team into the darkness. They moved in complete silence across the scarred landscape. The Krell had guards posted, but they were watching for threats from the outpost, not from the empty terrain behind their lines. Jake's team reached the target dropship and placed breaching charges on the hull. The explosion blew a hole in the side of the ship, and the humans poured through before the Krell crew could react. The fighting inside the 3 days into the siege, new Krell ships appeared in orbit above the planet. These were not troop transports, but specialized warfare vessels designed for planetary assault operations. Amy Chen tracked them on her sensors and watched as they deployed fresh units to the surface. The new arrivals were different from the standard Krell troops. Some were massive creatures that stood nearly 9 feet tall with enhanced muscle structure and reinforced armor. Others were smaller and carried sophisticated electronic equipment that suggested technical specialization. Lisa listened to Amy's translation of the intercepted Krell communications and learned that the big ones were called berserkers, genetically modified shock troops bred specifically for close combat. The smaller ones were technomancers who specialized in electronic warfare and shield technology. The Krell commanders were done underestimating humanity, and they were bringing their best warriors to finish the job. The alien forces established a fortified command post 5 kilometers from refuge. station and settled into a methodical siege. There would be no more frontal assaults or risky tunnel infiltrations. The Krell planned to surround the outpost, cut off all supply lines, and slowly crush the defenders through superior firepower and patience. Their new commanders were professional soldiers who had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. Inside Refuge Station, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Greg Sullivan reported that ammunition levels were down to 30%, despite careful rationing. Power reserves had dropped to 40% because the solar collectors had been damaged in the bombardment. Food supplies would last another 2 weeks at most if everyone went on half rations. Dr. Helen Carter had 23. Wounded personnel who required constant care and her medical supplies were running critically. Lisa gathered her senior staff in what remained of the command center. The walls were cracked and one entire section was open to the outside air because a Krell plasma strike had melted through the hull. Everyone looked exhausted because none of them had slept more than a few hours in the past 3 days. Greg presented his analysis of their situation, and it was bleak. They could not win a war of attrition against an enemy that had unlimited supplies and reinforcements. Pete Dawson suggested they could hold out in the deepest tunnels for months if they abandoned the surface entirely. Lisa shook her head because the Krell would just seal the tunnels and leave them to die slowly in the dark. Jake Morrison asked if there was any chance of rescue, but everyone knew the answer. The nearest human fleet was weeks away and would not arrive in time. Amy confirmed that her distress signals were being jammed by Krell electronic warfare systems. Greg proposed an audacious plan that made everyone in the room stare at him. If they could not outlast the Krell, then they needed to force a decisive battle on human terms. They needed to make the aliens commit everything to one massive assault, and then turn that assault into a catastrophic defeat. The plan was risky, and would require sacrificing large sections of the outpost, but it might be their only chance to break the siege. Lisa studied the tactical maps and saw what Greg was proposing. They would deliberately weaken their eastern defensive sector, and make it appear that human forces were concentrated on the western and northern approaches. The Krell would see the eastern sector as the path of least resistance and mass their forces for a breakthrough. What the aliens would not know was that the entire eastern sector would be one massive trap. Greg had spent the last 3 days rigging every building in the eastern sector with explosives. He had undermined the ground with mining charges placed at precise locations to create maximum devastation. He had hidden automated weapons platforms in camouflaged positions that would activate on command. The eastern sector would become a killing ground that would make the first battle look like a minor skirmish. Amy began feeding false information through the captured Krell communications equipment. She created fake reports suggesting that human ammunition was nearly exhausted and that the eastern defenses had suffered critical failures. She made it look like the humans were abandoning the eastern sector to consolidate their remaining forces. The Krell intelligence analysts studied the information and concluded that the eastern sector was the weak point they had been looking for. The alien commanders massed 2,000 of their best troops for the breakthrough assault. They included 600 berserkers who would lead the charge and smash through any remaining resistance. The Krell planned to pour through the gap and split the human defense in half. Victory seemed within reach after days of frustrating stalemate. Lisa positioned her actual forces in concealed locations around the eastern sector with clear lines of retreat. She told them exactly what would happen and when to pull back. Everyone understood their role because they had rehearsed this plan dozens of times in the past 2 days. Greg stood ready at the detonator controls with sweat running down his face despite the cold air. Amy monitored the Krell communications and counted down their approach. The Krell assault began exactly as predicted. The aliens advanced in massive formations with the berserkers in front. They met lighter resistance than expected and pushed deeper into the eastern sector. The few human defenders they encountered fell back quickly, seemingly in panic. The Krell commanders believed they had finally broken through and ordered all reserves to exploit the breakthrough. Thousands of alien warriors poured into the eastern sector. Lisa waited until the Krell were fully committed with no easy path of retreat. She gave the signal and Greg pressed every detonator simultaneously. The eastern sector exploded in a carefully orchestrated sequence of destruction. Buildings collapsed in timed demolitions that crushed hundreds of aliens beneath the rubble. The ground opened up as underground charges detonated and created massive sinkholes that swallowed entire Krell formations. Automated weapons platforms activated and poured fire into the confused and trapped enemy. The carnage lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was absolute. Over 1,500 Krell troops died in the trap. The survivors were stunned and disorganized, stumbling through the smoke and debris while human gunfire cut them down from hidden positions. The berserkers, who were supposed to be unstoppable, were crushed under tons of rubble or torn apart by crossfire they could not escape. Jake Morrison led his forces out of the tunnels behind the surviving Krell and cut off their retreat. The aliens found themselves trapped in a pocket with no way out and enemies on all sides. Some tried to surrender, but the humans were in no mood for mercy after losing so many friends. The battle became a massacre as the defenders took revenge for every casualty they had suffered. When the shooting finally stopped, nearly the entire Krell assault force had been eliminated. The humans had lost 31 defenders in the engagement, mostly from the fighting during the Krell retreat. Lisa walked through the devastation and counted the alien bodies. They had destroyed almost a third of the Krell ground forces in a single battle. The cost had been high, but the results were undeniable. The surviving Krell commanders were in complete crisis. They had now lost over 3,000 troops in 5 days of fighting. Their superiors in the Dominion were demanding explanations that the commanders could not provide. How could a single human outpost with fewer than 200 defenders be causing such catastrophic losses? The Krell had conquered dozens of species and never faced resistance like this. Amy intercepted the communications between the ground commanders and the fleet in orbit. The discussion was heated and desperate. The ground commanders were requesting permission to withdraw and regroup. The fleet commanders were refusing because retreat would be seen as unacceptable failure. Then Amy heard something that made her blood run cold. The Krell leadership had authorized the use of prohibited weapons. The aliens planned to deploy atmospheric incendiaries designed to create firestorms that would consume everything within a 50-kilometer radius. The weapons were banned by Galactic Convention because they were too indiscriminate and caused unnecessary suffering. The Krell no longer cared about conventions or rules. They wanted the humans dead, and they were willing to use any means necessary. Lisa received Amy's report and felt her stomach drop. They had 12 hours before the bombardment would begin. Once those weapons were deployed, nothing would save them. The outpost would burn and everyone in it would die. All their fighting and sacrifice would be for nothing because the Krell were willing to destroy the entire region rather than accept defeat. Greg looked at the tactical displays and made a suggestion that seemed insane. They needed to stop defending and start attacking. The Krell command post was where the bombardment strike was being coordinated from. If they could destroy the command post, they might prevent the attack. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but doing nothing meant certain death. Jake volunteered immediately to lead the assault. Lisa knew it was a suicide mission, but she also knew it was their only option. The command post was 5 kilometers away through Krell-controlled territory. It was defended by over 500 troops and sophisticated defensive systems. A frontal assault would be slaughtered before getting within a kilometer of the target. Lisa asked for 50 volunteers, and 90 people stepped forward. She selected. Lieutenant Jake Morrison led his 50-person assault team through the darkness, using the paths that Amy Chen had identified from studying Krell patrol patterns. The team moved in complete silence with weapons ready, and every sense alert for enemy contact. They had divided into 5 squads, with each squad assigned a specific target within the command post complex. Jake knew that most of them would not survive the night, but he also knew that failure meant death for everyone. Back at Refuge Station, the first 3 kilometers passed without incident because the Krell were focused on their siege lines and did not expect humans to be moving this deep into their territory. The aliens had grown complacent after establishing their fortified positions. They believed the humans were trapped and helpless. That mistake would cost them dearly. At the 4-kilometer mark, Jake's point man spotted a Krell patrol moving across their path. There were 8 aliens in the patrol carrying standard weapons and communication equipment. Jake made a quick decision and signaled for a silent takedown. His team moved like shadows and fell upon the patrol with knives and suppressed weapons. The Krell died without making a sound, but Jake knew their failure to report in would trigger an alarm within minutes. He ordered his team to abandon stealth and run. They had 1 kilometer left to cover, and speed was now more important than concealment. The 50 humans sprinted across the alien-controlled ground while alarms began sounding behind them. Krell troops started moving to intercept, but the humans had a head start and they used it well. The command post loomed ahead in the darkness. It was a complex of reinforced structures protected by shield generators and automated weapons platforms. Over 500 Krell defenders guarded it with overlapping fields of fire and prepared defensive positions. The perimeter defenses were designed to stop a major assault by conventional forces. Jake hoped they were not designed to stop 50 desperate humans with nothing left to lose. The assault began with simultaneous attacks from 4 directions. Squads 1 through 4 hit the perimeter defenses with everything they had. Grenades and rockets flew into the Krell positions while human gunfire raked the defensive lines. The noise was deafening and the confusion was exactly what Jake needed. While the Krell focused on repelling the 4 attacks, Squad 5 moved toward the primary structure from an unexpected angle. Amy Chen had insisted on joining the assault team despite Lisa's objections. She was the only one who could hack into the Krell computer systems fast enough to matter. She ran with Jake's squad while bullets and plasma bolts flew overhead. Greg Sullivan was right beside her carrying the demolition charges that would bring down the command post. Neither of them were combat soldiers, but both understood that technical expertise was just as important as fighting skills on this mission. Jake's squad reached the main structure and used breaching charges to blow open an entrance. They poured through the smoking hole and into the interior where Krell officers were scrambling to organize a defense. The fighting inside was brutal and close range. Jake shot 3 aliens before his rifle ran empty and he switched to his sidearm. One of his team members went down with a plasma burn to the chest. Another fell when a Krell officer's claws ripped through his armor. Amy found a computer terminal and connected her hacking equipment while Jake's remaining squad members formed a defensive perimeter around her. Her fingers flew across the interface as she broke through layer after layer of Krell security. Plasma bolts hit the wall next to her head, but she did not flinch. She uploaded the virus she had prepared and watched as the command post shield generators went offline. The automated defenses locked up and stopped firing. Greg moved through the structure, placing shaped charges on support columns and critical junctions. He worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent his entire life working with explosives and understood exactly how much force was needed to bring down a building. The timer on each charge was synchronized to detonate in 4 minutes. That should be enough time to withdraw if everything went perfectly. Nothing went perfectly because Krell reinforcements arrived faster than anyone had anticipated. Over 200 fresh troops surrounded the command post and cut off all escape routes. The 4 squads that had attacked the perimeter tried to fight their way out, but they were badly outnumbered. Jake heard the desperate radio calls from his other squad leaders reporting that they were pinned down and taking heavy casualties. He made the hardest decision of his young life. He ordered the surviving members of the other squads to scatter and attempt to break through the Krell lines in small groups. Some might make it back to Refuge Station if they moved fast and used the darkness for cover. He and 15 volunteers from Squad 5 would stay behind to hold the command post until the charges detonated. Someone had to make sure the Krell did not defuse the explosives. 28 members of the assault team fought their way out of the Krell encirclement. They ran through enemy fire and disappeared into the night while Krell troops pursued them. Some would make it home and others would die in the darkness, but they all fought with everything they had. Back at the command post, Jake and his rear guard prepared to make their final stand. The Krell realized what the humans had done and threw everything they had at the command post to reach the explosives. Berserkers smashed through walls while regular troops poured in through every entrance. Jake's team fought from room to room and floor to floor, trading their lives for seconds of time. Greg stayed at the detonator ready to trigger it manually if the automatic timer failed. Amy kept her virus running to prevent the Krell from regaining control of their systems. The timer counted down with agonizing slowness. 3 minutes became 2 minutes. Jake shot a berserker in the face at point-blank range and watched it fall. One of his volunteers tackled a Krell officer who was trying to reach the explosives. 2 minutes became 1 minute. The building shook from plasma fire and the walls were on fire. 30 seconds remained and Jake could hear the Krell breaking through their last defensive positions. The charges detonated exactly on schedule. The command post exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. The structure collapsed in on itself and killed everyone inside, including Jake Morrison and his brave rear guard. The blast wave spread outward and caught the Krell reinforcements who had been trying to storm the building. Over 300 aliens died in the explosion or the collapse that followed. Lisa Bennett saw the explosion from refuge station 5 kilometers away. She stood on the damaged wall and watched the bright flash in the distance. She knew what it meant. Jake had succeeded, but he would not be coming home. She closed her eyes for a moment to honor the dead, and then opened them again because there was still work to do. The Krell would counterattack and she needed to be ready. Over the next 6 hours, 21 members of the assault team made it back to refuge station. They arrived in small groups, wounded and exhausted but alive. Each one had a story of close calls and near misses. They had fought running battles against Krell pursuit teams and used every trick they knew to survive. The price had been terrible, but the mission was a success. Amy brought back the intelligence data she had downloaded from the Krell systems before the explosion. The files revealed that the Krell had lost over 4,000 troops in the siege. Their commanders had been sending increasingly desperate reports back to the Dominion, asking for massive reinforcements or permission to withdraw. More importantly, the data showed that a Krell supply convoy was scheduled to arrive in orbit within 18 hours to resupply their ground forces. Greg Sullivan studied the convoy data and saw an opportunity. Refuge Station had 3 light transport shuttles that were normally used for cargo runs to orbit. They were unarmed and unarmored, but they were all the humans had. If they could modify the shuttles and use them to attack the supply convoy, they might be able to cripple the Krell logistics chain and leave the ground forces stranded without support. Lisa listened to Greg's plan and understood how desperate it was. The shuttles would be flying bombs guided remotely from the ground. Amy would pilot them using the hacked Krell identification codes to get close to the convoy before the aliens realized what was happening. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. If they destroyed the supply convoy, the Krell would have to choose between retreating or fighting without adequate ammunition and supplies. Dr. Helen Carter protested that using the shuttles would eliminate any possibility of evacuation. Lisa agreed but pointed out that the Krell blockade made evacuation impossible anyway. Better to use the shuttles as weapons than let them sit uselessly in the hangar. The remaining defenders voted and the decision was unanimous. They would strike at the supply convoy and hope it was enough to break the siege. Greg began stripping down the shuttles to reduce weight and increase their payload capacity. He installed every remaining explosive charge and mine they had salvaged from the destroyed sections of the outpost. Each shuttle became a flying bomb with enough destructive power to cripple a large ship. Amy programmed the remote control systems and practiced the approach vectors until she could fly the course in her sleep. The Krell forces were regrouping after the destruction of their command post. The surviving commanders were trying. The final Krell assault began at dawn with 3,000 alien warriors advancing from all directions in one massive wave. Commander Lisa Bennett watched them come and knew this was the end of everything. Her remaining defenders numbered less than 100, and their ammunition would not last more than an hour of sustained combat. The Krell had abandoned all tactical sophistication and were simply throwing overwhelming force at the outpost to crush it through sheer numbers. The human defensive positions opened fire when the aliens reached maximum effective range. Kinetic rounds tore through the advancing Krell ranks and dropped dozens of warriors with each volley. The aliens returned fire with their energy weapons and plasma bolts hammered the human bunkers and barriers. The noise was deafening and the air filled with smoke and the smell of burning metal and flesh. Within the first 30 minutes, the outer defensive line collapsed under the weight of the assault. The Krell climbed over their own dead to reach the human positions and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Pete Dawson triggered the final demolition charges and brought down entire sections of the outpost on top of the advancing aliens. Hundreds died in the explosions, but hundreds more kept coming like an unstoppable tide. Lisa fought alongside her troops with a rifle in her hands and grim determination in her heart. She had accepted that she would die here, but she was determined to take as many Krell with her as possible. The defenders fell back to secondary positions and then to tertiary positions as each line was overrun. They sold their lives dearly and made the aliens pay in blood for every meter of ground. High above the planet, Amy Chen launched the 3 modified shuttles toward orbit using the remote control systems that Greg had installed. The shuttles accelerated away from the surface while broadcasting the hacked Krell identification codes that Amy had programmed into their systems. The orbital sensors registered them as civilian evacuation craft, fleeing the doomed outpost. The Krell fleet commanders barely noticed them because their Attention was focused on the ground battle that was finally going in their favor. The supply convoy arrived in orbit exactly on schedule, with 12 large transport ships carrying ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and replacement equipment for the ground forces. The convoy moved into position to begin transferring supplies down to the surface. The ships were lightly defended because no one expected an attack this deep inside the Krell blockade. The greatest threat they anticipated was navigational hazards or equipment failures. Amy guided the shuttles closer to the convoy while her hands trembled on the controls. She had practiced this approach hundreds of times in simulation, but this was real and there would be no second chance. The first shuttle approached the convoy perimeter, and the Krell defense systems finally recognized something was wrong. Point defense weapons locked onto the shuttle and opened fire. The shuttle exploded in a ball of fire before it could reach any of the supply ships. The second shuttle came in from a different angle, while the Krell defenses were focused on the first. Amy pushed it to maximum acceleration and aimed directly at the cluster of transport ships. The shuttle weaved through defensive fire and reached the convoy before being destroyed. It detonated among the supply ships, and the explosion tore two transports apart while crippling a third. Secondary explosions rippled through the damaged vessels as their cargo ignited. The third shuttle was Amy's last chance, and she flew it with desperate precision. The Krell defenses were fully alert now, and tracking the incoming threat with every weapon they had. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds filled the space around the shuttle, but Amy kept it on course through a combination of skill and luck. She aimed for the largest ship in the convoy, the flagship supply carrier that held the bulk of the ammunition and fuel. The shuttle impacted the carrier's hull and penetrated deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion was catastrophic because it triggered the carrier's munitions and fuel stores. The ship disintegrated in a massive fireball that lit up the orbital space. The blast wave caught 8 additional ships and either destroyed them outright or damaged them so badly they had to be abandoned. Within seconds, the entire Krell supply convoy had been effectively annihilated. The surviving Krell commanders in orbit watched in horror as their logistics chain went up in flames. Without those supplies, the ground forces were cut off from resupply and stranded on the planet with limited ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. The situation had gone from certain victory to potential disaster in less than 5 minutes. The fleet commanders began emergency consultations with Dominion High Command while trying to assess the extent of the catastrophe. On the ground, the Krell assault continued for another 2 hours before the aliens began to run out of ammunition. The warriors who had been firing their energy weapons continuously found their power cells depleted. The berserkers who had been leading the charge discovered their enhanced physiology could not overcome simple exhaustion and ammunition shortages. The assault began to lose momentum as tired and supply-starved troops struggled to maintain the offensive. Lisa recognized the shift in the battle and made a decision that seemed insane to everyone who heard it. She ordered a counterattack. The remaining defenders, fewer than 40 combat-capable personnel, charged out of their defensive positions and hit the exhausted Krell forces like a hammer blow. The aliens who had never seen a defending force attack when on the verge of defeat were completely unprepared for this reversal. The counterattack broke the Krell lines and sent the aliens retreating in disorder. The shock of being attacked by an enemy they thought was beaten proved too much for warriors who were already exhausted and low on ammunition. The retreat turned into a rout as Krell troops abandoned their weapons and fled back toward their staging areas. Lisa led her people forward and they killed every alien who was too slow to escape. Back at the Krell staging areas, the surviving commanders tried to restore order, but found their troops demoralized and broken. They had lost over 1,500 warriors in the assault and had gained nothing. Their ammunition was down to less than 30%. Medical supplies were exhausted and hundreds of wounded were dying because there was no way to treat them properly. The supply convoy that was supposed to sustain them had been destroyed. The command structure was in chaos and no one knew what to do next. The psychological impact was devastating. The Krell were conquerors who had defeated dozens of species across the galaxy. They had been broken by a single human outpost with fewer than 200 defenders. The shame was unbearable, and the troops began to lose faith in their commanders and their mission. Some headed for the dropships hoping to evacuate. Others simply wandered away from their positions in a daze. The Krell invasion force ceased to exist as a coherent military unit. In orbit, the fleet commanders made their final decision. The ground operation was a complete failure, and continuing it would only result in more losses. They needed to evacuate immediately and destroy all evidence of their defeat before human reinforcements arrived. They began recalling dropships and preparing the fleet for emergency departure. The problem was that there were still over 1,000 Krell troops, scattered across the surface, and retrieving them all would take days. The fleet did not have days because Dominion High Command was demanding immediate withdrawal. The commanders made a cold calculation based on military necessity and political survival. They would evacuate the senior officers and elite units, approximately 300 personnel, and abandon the rest to whatever fate awaited them. The dropships began landing at the staging areas and loading only the priority personnel. Within hours, the fleet jumped to hyperspace and left the remaining ground forces stranded on the hostile planet. The abandoned Krell troops realized what had happened, and their morale collapsed completely. They were stranded on a planet with enemies who had every reason to kill them. No supplies, no support, and no hope of rescue. Over the next 2 weeks, small groups of Krell approached Refuge Station attempting to surrender. Lisa accepted the surrenders but kept the aliens under heavy guard because she had lost too many friends to trust. Them other Krell fled into the wilderness and died of exposure or starvation because they were not equipped to survive in the planet's harsh environment. The mighty invasion force that had arrived with such confidence was reduced to scattered remnants begging for mercy or dying alone in the wild. The Battle of Refuge Station was over, and humanity had won a victory that should have been impossible. The outpost itself was a ruin barely held together by emergency repairs and sheer determination. Of the original 200 personnel, 63 had survived, and every single one was wounded to some degree. Greg Sullivan kept the critical systems running through constant improvisation and repairs. Dr. Helen Carter worked without rest, treating both human and alien wounded. Because her medical ethics would not allow her to let anyone die if she could prevent it, Amy Chen sent distress signals on all frequencies, hoping that human ships would arrive before her makeshift communication systems failed completely. She had done everything possible to keep people alive, and now all she could do was wait and hope. Lisa walked through the ruins of her command and felt the weight of all the deaths pressing down on